Darius Jackson, a 38-year-old black architect in a crisp gray suit, steps into the first-class cabin of a packed Atlanta to Seattle flight, only to lock eyes with flight attendant Karen Voss, her sneer slicing through the hum of boarding. Chatter. She charges over, barking that he's in the wrong seat before he even sits, stunning onlookers. 3 minutes later, the captain's voice booms. She's fired. Yet, hushed murmurs spread, hinting her exit masks a brewing storm. What's she planning next? Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. If you stand for justice, hit like and subscribe for more gripping tales. Darius Jackson eased into his plush first-class seat, the leather creaking softly under his weight. His carry-on stowed overhead with a satisfying click. The cabin buzzed with the shuffle of passengers settling in, their voices a low hum against the faint whine of the engines warming up outside Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. He smoothed the lapels of his gray suit, the fabric cool against his fingertips, and pulled his boarding pass from his jacket pocket, glancing at it to confirm what he already knew. Seat 2A, right where he sat. His broad shoulders relaxed, and a flicker of pride warmed his chest. Years of late nights drafting blueprints had earned him this spot, a rare treat on this 6-hour haul to Seattle. He adjusted his glasses, the thin frames glinting under the cabin lights, and let his gaze drift out the window where baggage handlers scurried across the tarmac, their orange vests glowing in the late afternoon sun. The plane smelled of recycled air and faint traces of lavender cleaner, a sterile calm before takeoff. Then a shadow fell over him, sharp and uninvited. He turned his head, and there she was, Karen Voss, the flight attendant from the galley, her blonde hair pulled tight into a bun, her uniform pristine but her face twisted with something sour. Her blue eyes narrowed, locking onto him like he was a smudge on her perfectly ordered world. Before he could speak, her voice sliced through the air, loud enough to turn heads 3 rows back. "Excuse me, sir. You're in the wrong seat. You need to move. Now." Her words snapped out, clipped and accusatory, dripping with an edge that made the couple across the aisle freeze mid-conversation. Darius blinked, caught off guard, his pulse quickening as the cabin's hum faltered. He tilted his head slightly, keeping his tone even, smooth as polished steel. "I'm in 2A. This is my seat." He held up his boarding pass, the paper crisp between his fingers, offering it to her with a steady hand. She snatched it, her manicured nails brushing his skin, and scanned it with a frown that deepened into a scowl. Her lips pursed, and she thrust it back at him, the motion abrupt like she couldn't bear to touch it longer than necessary. "This doesn't look right," she said, her voice tightening, each syllable laced with disbelief. "People like you don't belong up here." The words landed like a slap, raw and unfiltered, her racism hanging in the air for everyone to hear. A gasp rippled from a woman 2 seats over, her hand flying to her mouth, while a businessman in a pinstripe suit coughed awkwardly into his fist. Darius's jaw clenched, but he kept his cool, his dark eyes steady on hers. "Check it again," he said, calm but firm, refusing to let her shake him. Karen's nostrils flared, and she shook her head, a small, stubborn jerk, as if she could will the truth away. "I don't need to. I'll verify it with the system," she snapped, spinning on her heel and marching toward the galley, her shoes clicking against the floor with sharp, angry beats. The cabin tilted into silence, broken only by the rustle of a magazine as a passenger flipped pages too fast. Darius leaned back, exhaling slowly, his fingers tapping the armrest, feeling the weight of curious stares prickling his skin. A teenage girl in 3C pulled out her phone, angling it discreetly, the faint click of her camera shutter slicing through the quiet. Another passenger, a gray-haired man with a thick beard, leaned over and muttered, "Unbelievable," his voice low but thick with disgust. Darius gave a slight nod, acknowledging the support, though his mind churned. He'd dealt with this before, the sidelong glances, the assumptions, but never so loud, so public. Minutes ticked by, the boarding line thinning as stragglers hauled bags into overhead bins. Then Karen returned, her strides quick, her posture rigid like a coiled spring ready to snap. She stopped beside his seat, her shadow looming again, her expression no softer than before. "I've checked," she said, her tone curt, clipped like she was spitting out nails. There's a glitch. This seat's not yours. Move to economy, or I'll call security. Her arms crossed, her badge catching the light. A glint of authority she wielded like a blade. Darius met her gaze, unflinching, his voice steady as stone. There's no glitch. You've got my pass. It's valid. I'm staying. Her eyes widened for a split second, surprise flickering before hardening into something colder. You're holding up boarding, she hissed, her voice rising, drawing more eyes. Move, or I'll make you. The threat hung heavy, and the air thickened, passengers shifting in their seats, some uncomfortable, others outright staring. A young woman with braids, seated in 4B, pulled out her phone too, her thumb hovering over the record button, her lips parted in shock. Darius didn't budge, his posture solid, a quiet defiance radiating from him. Call who you need to, he said, his words measured, cutting through her bluster. I'm not moving. Karen's jaw tightened, her face flushing, red, a vein pulsing at her temple. She spun away, storming back to the galley, her heels pounding the aisle like gunfire. Whispers erupted around Darius, a low buzz of speculation threading through the cabin. She's out of line, a voice muttered from behind. Can't believe she said that, another hissed. The teenage girl's phone stayed up, capturing every second, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and outrage. Across the aisle, a woman in a teal blazer, Mia Torres, a nurse heading to Seattle for a conference, watched Darius with quiet respect, her fingers tightening around her water bottle. He caught her glance and offered a faint nod, a silent thank you for the unspoken solidarity. The tension simmered, a pot ready to boil over, when a new figure emerged from the front. Tom Reese, the cabin supervisor, a wiry man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a tablet tucked under his arm. His steps were deliberate, his face neutral but his eyes sharp, taking in the scene. He stopped at Darius's seat, his voice low, professional. Sir, mind if I see your boarding pass? Darius handed it over without a word, his movements smooth, confident. Tom swiped through his tablet, his brow furrowing as he cross-checked the data, then nodded. This checks out. Seat 2A, Darius Jackson. You're good here. He turned, scanning the aisle for Karen, who lingered near the galley curtain, her arms still crossed, her glare piercing. Karen, it's confirmed, Tom called, his tone firm, leaving no room for argument. He's staying. Her lips parted, a protest forming, but Tom's raised hand cut her off. Enough. Let's keep this moving. The passengers exhaled collectively, a wave of relief washing over them, though the air stayed charged. Karen's eyes locked on Darius one last time, a storm brewing behind them, her humiliation palpable. She retreated to the galley, her shoulders stiff, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. Darius settled back, his victory small but real, the weight of her words still echoing in his ears. He reached for his book, a worn copy of Invisible Man, flipping it open to steady his nerves. The pages a familiar anchor, the cabin settled into a fragile calm, the engines rumbling louder as takeoff neared. He glanced out the window again, the tarmac blurring as the plane taxied, his mind easing into the rhythm of flight. Then, a faint rustle broke his focus. A folded note slid under his tray table, the paper stark white against the dark wood. He unfolded it, his breath catching as he read the scrawled words. You'll regret this. The handwriting was jagged, angry, unmistakably hers. His pulse spiked, a cold prickle racing down his spine. He scanned the cabin, but Karen was out of sight, hidden behind the galley curtain. The teenage girl still filmed, her lens catching the shift in his expression, while Mia's eyes flicked to him, sensing something off. The plane lifted off, climbing into the sky, but Darius's gut twisted. This wasn't over. Her firing, if it even happened, wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something uglier, something he couldn't yet see. He tucked the note into his pocket, his fingers brushing the boarding pass, a reminder of the fight he'd just won, and the one he hadn't seen coming. The plane hummed at 35,000 feet, slicing through wisps of cloud over the sprawling patchwork of Tennessee farmland below. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. Darius Jackson sat in seat 2A, his book resting unopened on the tray table, its spine creased from years of wear. His fingers lingered on the note from Karen Voss, now crumpled in his pocket. The jagged scrawl of, "You'll regret this," burning in his mind like a lit fuse. He adjusted his glasses, the frames cool against his skin, and let his gaze drift to the window, where the sky stretched endless and gray, a deceptive calm mirroring the cabin's fragile quiet. The engines droned steady, a low rumble that couldn't drown out the unease twisting in his gut. Passengers around him settled into their routines. The businessman in 1C typed furiously on a laptop, his tie loosened. The teenage girl in 3C scrolled her phone, her earbuds leaking faint bass beats. Mia Torres, the nurse in 4B, sipped water from a plastic cup, her braided hair catching the light. The air smelled faintly of roasted almonds from a snack cart trundling down the aisle, pushed by a younger flight attendant with a nervous smile. Then, a sharp crackle split the silence, the intercom flaring to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," a deep voice boomed, steady but edged with authority. "Due to multiple passenger complaints, flight attendant Karen Voss has been relieved of her duties effective immediately. We apologize for any disruption and appreciate your patience as we ensure a smooth flight to Seattle." The words hung heavy, a thunderclap in the stillness. Cheers erupted, sporadic at first, then swelling into a wave. The gray-haired man behind, Darius, clapped twice, his thick fingers smacking together with a satisfying thud. "About time," he bellowed, his beard quivering with approval. The teenage girl yanked out an earbud, her eyes wide, and pumped a fist, her phone still clutched tight. Mia turned to Darius, her brown eyes warm, her voice cutting through the din. "You handled that like a pro. Most people would have lost it, but you? Solid as a rock." Her words carried a quiet strength, a nod to his composure under Karen's venomous assault. Darius offered a small smile, his lips parting just enough to show gratitude, though his chest tightened with a flicker of pride. "Thanks," he said, his tone low, steady. "Just wanted to sit where I belong." The victory tasted sweet, fleeting as it was, a rare moment where justice seemed to tip in his favor. He leaned back, the leather cushioning his shoulders, and exhaled, letting the tension seep out like water through cracked earth. The cabin buzzed anew, passengers whispering about Karen's downfall, their voices a mix of disbelief and glee. "She had it coming," a woman in a teal scarf muttered, her knitting needles clicking furiously. "Saying that out loud? In front of everyone?" The businessman glanced up from his screen, his brow furrowed. "Airline's got no choice now. She's toast." Darius's fingers brushed the note again, its edges sharp against his skin, but he pushed it down, willing himself to savor the win. Karen was gone, publicly shamed, her authority stripped mid-flight. What could she do from the galley, sidelined and powerless? He reached for his book, flipping it open, the familiar words a balm to his nerves. The plane sailed on, the sky outside darkening as dusk crept in, a thin line of orange hugging the horizon. Mia uncapped her water again, her gaze lingering on him, a silent ally in the chaos. The teenage girl's thumbs flew across her phone, likely tweeting the captain's announcement to the world. For a moment, Darius felt the weight lift, the cabin's energy shifting to his side. Then, a faint clatter echoed from the galley, a metallic ping that made his ears prick. He glanced over, catching a glimpse of Karen through the curtains, slit, her blonde bun still tight, her uniform crisp despite her disgrace. She wasn't pacing or sulking. She stood hunched over a counter, her phone pressed to her ear, her free hand tapping a rhythm against a steel tray. Her lips moved fast, too quiet to hear, but the intensity in her posture sent a chill racing up Darius's spine. Who was she calling? What gears were turning behind those icy blue eyes? He shifted in his seat, the leather creaking, his calm fraying at the edges. The younger flight attendant rolled the cart past, her smile faltering as she caught his stare, her hands trembling slightly on the handle. The cabin lights flickered, a quick stutter that drew a collective gasp, then steadied. A glitch, maybe? Or something more? Darius's pulse quickened, the note's threat pulsing louder in his mind. Karen's firing wasn't the end. It was a spark, She vanished behind the curtain, her phone call done, and the galley fell silent. Minutes later, Tom Reese, the supervisor, emerged, his tablet glowing in his hand, his face etched with fatigue. He moved down the aisle, checking on passengers, his voice a murmur as he reassured the woman with the scarf. Darius watched him, waiting for a sign, but Tom avoided his gaze, his steps deliberate, almost cautious. The plane droned on, the altitude steady, but the air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Mia set her cup down, her brow creasing as she followed Darius's line of sight. "You okay?" she asked, her tone soft but probing. He nodded, forcing a tight smile. "Yeah, just processing." She didn't push, but her eyes lingered, sharp with intuition. The teenage girl's phone pinged, a notification lighting up her screen, and she gasped, her fingers freezing mid-scroll. "No way," she whispered, loud enough for Darius to hear. He turned, catching her stunned expression, but before he could ask, the lights flickered again, longer this time, a shudder rippling through the cabin. The cheers from earlier faded, replaced by uneasy murmurs. "What's going on up there?" the businessman grumbled, slamming his laptop shut. Darius's hand tightened on his book, the victory slipping through his fingers like sand. Karen's call, the flickers, the note. They weren't random. She was plotting something, her shaming only fuel for a bigger fire. He glanced out the window again, the sky now a deep bruise of purple, the horizon swallowed by night. The plane soared over Missouri halfway to Seattle, but the real journey was just beginning. What had she set in motion? Hey folks, if you think Karen got what she deserved, drop a #1 in the comments. If you're furious she'd stoop this low even after getting canned, hit that like button to show some love for Darius's fight. And if you're all in for seeing justice unfold in wild, unexpected ways, subscribe now. We've got so much more coming your way. Tell us, what's the boldest stand you've taken against unfairness? Now here's the real kicker. What's Karen whispering into that phone? Could it be a petty jab? Or is she cooking up something way darker to hit Darius? Where it hurts? Stick around to find it. The plane cruised at a steady hum, slicing through the ink-black sky somewhere over Kansas. The cabin bathed in a muted glow from overhead lights that buzzed faintly with each passing minute. Darius Jackson sat rigid in seat 2A, his book abandoned, on the tray table, its pages fluttering slightly in the recycled air. His fingers gripped the armrests, the leather cool and slick under his palms, his gray suit jacket unbuttoned now, revealing a white shirt, damp with a thin sheen of sweat. The note from Karen Voss sat heavy in his pocket, its words a splinter lodged in his mind, gnawing at the edges of his calm. Outside, the window framed a void, stars swallowed by thick clouds, the horizon lost to the night. The cabin smelled of stale coffee and nervous tension, the earlier cheers replaced by a restless quiet. Mia Torres, across the aisle, flipped through, a medical journal, her pen tapping a slow rhythm against the page, her brow creased with unease. The teenage girl in 3C slept, her phone dark in her lap, earbuds dangling loose. Then, without warning, the plane lurched, a violent jolt that sent cups clattering off trays and yanked a scream from the woman with the teal scarf 3 rows back. The cabin tilted sharply, oxygen masks dropping from the ceiling in a tangle of yellow plastic, their tubes swaying like vines. Passengers gasped, hands clawing for the masks, voices rising in a chaotic swell. "What's happening?" the businessman in 1C shouted, his laptop sliding to the floor with a dull thud. Darius's heart slammed against his ribs, his breath catching as he yanked the mask over his face, the rubber cold and bitter against his lips. The plane shuddered again, a deep groan echoing through the fuselage, metal straining under some unseen force. The lights flickered wildly, plunging the cabin into strobing shadows, then snapped back on, harsh and blinding. Through the chaos, Darius's eyes darted to the galley, where Karen Voss stood framed by the curtain, her blonde bun glinting under the glare. Her lips curled into a smirk, faint but unmistakable, her arms crossed casually over her chest. Then, as the plane leveled slightly, she slipped a hand into her apron pocket, the metallic glint of a wrench catching the light before vanishing from sight. His stomach dropped, a cold certainty locking into place. She'd done this. The turbulence wasn't natural. It was her handiwork, a calculated strike masked as a glitch. The intercom crackled, Tom Reese's voice cutting through the panic, strained but steady. "Everyone, please remain seated and secure your masks. We're experiencing unexpected turbulence. Stay calm." The words did little to soothe the cabin, where whimpers mingled with the creak of seats as passengers braced themselves. Mia met Darius's gaze, her eyes wide, her journal crumpled in her lap. "This isn't normal," she mouthed, her voice lost to the din. He nodded, his jaw tight, his mind racing. The plane steadied, the shaking easing into a tense hum, but the air felt electric, primed for the next blow. Then Karen emerged, her strides purposeful, her uniform pristine despite the chaos. She leaned toward Tom, who stood near the front, his tablet trembling in his hands. Her voice was low, but Darius caught the venom in her tone, her finger jabbing toward him. "He threatened me earlier, said he'd make me pay. Check his bag, he's got something in there." The lie was bold, brazen, her eyes glinting with malice as she spun her tale. Tom's face tightened, his gaze flicking to Darius, uncertainty clouding his features. "That's a serious accusation, Karen," he said, his voice low, wary. "I've got proof," she snapped, pulling out her phone, her thumb swiping to a grainy photo of Darius holding the note. Snapped from an angle that made it look like he was writing it. "He slipped this to me, said he'd crash us all." The passengers nearby turned, their stares piercing, a mix of fear and suspicion. The teenage girl stirred, blinking awake, her hand fumbling for her phone. Mia's pen froze, her lips parting, in disbelief. Darius's pulse roared in his ears, his calm fracturing under the weight of her audacity. "That's nonsense," he said, his voice rising, firm but controlled. "She gave me that note. She's lying." Karen's smirk widened, a predator scenting blood. "Why would I risk my job over you? You're the one causing trouble." Tom hesitated, his fingers tightening on the tablet, then sighed. "Sir, I need to restrain you until we sort this out, for everyone's safety." Before Darius could protest, 2 crew members flanked him, their hands rough as they yanked, his arms behind his back. Cold metal bit into his wrists, the handcuffs clicking shut with a finality that echoed in the cabin. Gasps rippled through the seats, the woman with the scarf clutching her knitting needles like a weapon. "This is insane," Mia shouted, standing halfway, her journal tumbling to the floor. "He's done nothing." The teenage girl's phone was up now, filming, her breaths quick and shallow. Tom raised a hand, his voice sharp. "Ma'am, sit down. We're handling it." Darius was dragged from his seat, his glasses slipping down his nose, his suit jacket twisting as they hauled him toward the rear. The cabin blurred past, faces a mix of shock and judgment, the air thick with whispers. "Maybe she's right," the businessman muttered, his eyes narrow. "He didn't look scared," another voice hissed. Darius's mind spun, his victory from Karen's firing a distant memory. He'd beaten her once, faced down her racism with proof, and now she'd flipped the script, painting him as the villain. The crew shoved him into a jump seat near the back, the wall hard against his spine, the cuffs cutting into his skin. He sat, chest heaving, his gaze locked on the galley ahead. Karen lingered there, her smirk gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. She turned to the radio, her fingers deft as she adjusted the headset, her voice a murmur as she spoke to ground. "Control, we've got a situation. Passenger in 2A Darius Jackson, possible sabotage, requesting security on landing." The words filtered back to him, faint but clear, a dagger twisting deeper. She wasn't just framing him for this chaos. She was setting him up for something bigger, something that would follow him off the plane. The cabin settled into an uneasy hush, the turbulence gone, the masks dangling unused as oxygen flowed steady again. Mia twisted in her seat, her eyes searching for him, her fists clenched in silent fury. The teenage girl kept filming, her lens, a lifeline he couldn't reach. Tom approached, his face grim, his tablet dark now. "We'll figure this out when we land," he said, his tone flat, avoiding Darius's gaze. "Just stay put." Darius nodded, his throat dry, his mind racing. He'd thought he'd won, thought Karen's shaming was the endgame. But this was war, and she'd struck with a ferocity he hadn't seen coming. The plane droned on. The sky outside a black abyss, the cabin a pressure cooker of doubt and fear. He shifted, the cuffs chafing, his glasses fogging with each breath through the mask he still wore. Karen's wrench, her lie, her radio call. They were pieces of a puzzle snapping into place. She'd sabotaged the flight, risked lives, all to bury him. And as the altitude held steady, he knew the real danger wasn't the turbulence. It was what waited in Seattle, where her trap would spring wide open. The note in his pocket felt heavier now, a promise she intended to keep. The plane sliced through the night sky, its engines a steady growl as it crossed into Idaho. The cabin lights dimmed to a faint flicker, casting long shadows across the rows of seats. Darius Jackson sat shackled in the jump seat at the rear, his wrists raw from the cuffs, the metal edges biting deeper with each subtle shift. His gray suit hung loose now, the jacket twisted from the crew's rough handling, his glasses smudged and perched unevenly on his nose. The air smelled of sweat and fear, the earlier chaos of dropping masks and shuddering metal replaced by a brittle silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of a blanket or a stifled cough. His book lay abandoned in 2A, a distant relic of a calmer moment, while the note from Karen Voss burned a hole in his pocket, its threat no longer abstract. Up front, passengers settled into an uneasy truce with the flight, their masks stowed, their eyes darting back to him with suspicion or pity. Mia Torres twisted in her seat, her braids swinging as she shot him a look of fierce support, her journal clutched tight like a shield. The teenage girl in 3C tapped her phone, her footage a silent witness to the madness, her face pale but determined. The plane leveled out, the turbulence a memory, and Darius let his head rest against the wall, the cold steel grounding him as his mind churned. He'd beaten Karen's first strike, proven his seat was his, and now she'd turned the tables, her sabotage pinning him as the villain. The cuffs felt like a brand, marking him for a crime he didn't commit. Then, a soft chime rang out, the seatbelt sign blinking off, and the cabin stirred. Tom Reese appeared, his wiry frame tense, his tablet glowing in his hand. He crouched, beside Darius, his voice low, strained. "We've got a problem sorted. Your bag's clean, and there's video showing her with that wrench. You're clear." Relief washed over Darius, a cool wave cutting through the heat of his anger. He nodded, his jaw tight, as Tom unlocked the cuffs, the metal clanking free. His wrists throbbed, red welts blooming where the steel had dug in, but he stood smoothing his suit, reclaiming his dignity. "Told you," he said, his tone steady, a quiet triumph threading through it. Tom sighed, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, sorry about this. Head back to your seat." Darius moved forward, the aisle stretching long and narrow, passengers watching. As he passed, Mia stood, her voice sharp with relief. "You're tougher than steel, man. She's got nothing on you now." The teenage girl grinned, holding up her phone. "Got it all. She's done." Whispers of support rippled through the cabin, the businessman in 1C nodding grudgingly, the woman with the teal scarf offering a tight smile. Darius sank into 2A, the leather welcoming him back, his book still there, a lifeline to sanity. He adjusted his glasses, exhaling slow, the weight of the cuffs lifting, replaced by a fragile hope. Karen's lie had crumbled, Mia's video his, salvation, and the cabin's tide seemed to turn. He glanced toward the galley, but Karen was gone, her absence a victory he could taste. The plane droned on, the sky outside a starless black, the altitude steady at 35,000 feet. He reached for his water, the plastic cup cool in his hand, and took a sip, letting the moment settle. The passengers relaxed, some dozing, others murmuring about the crazy flight attendant. For a heartbeat, Darius believed he'd won again, that her firing and this exoneration were the end of her reach. Then, the descent began, a gentle dip as the plane angled toward Seattle, the engines shifting pitch. The intercom crackled, the captain's voice calm but clipped. We're beginning our approach to Seattle-Tacoma. Please fasten your seatbelts." The cabin complied, a rustle of clicks filling the air. Darius buckled in, his fingers steady, his mind easing into the promise of solid ground. The lights brightened, the sky outside lightening to a bruised purple as the city's glow crept into view. The landing gear whirred, a low thud signaling the final stretch. He glanced at Mia, who gave a thumbs up, her smile a beacon in the gloom. The plane touched down, tires kissing the tarmac with a soft screech, and a collective sigh swept through the cabin. The jet taxied to the gate, the engines winding down, the air thick with relief. Darius unbuckled, standing to grab his carry-on, his shoulders squared, ready to leave this nightmare behind. The door hissed open, cool Seattle air flooding in, sharp with the scent of rain and jet fuel. He stepped into the aisle, Mia behind him, the teenage girl pocketing her phone with a nod. Then, chaos erupted. Armed police stormed the jet bridge, their boots pounding the floor, radios crackling with static. "Darius Jackson!" a voice bellowed, harsh and commanding. "Hands up now!" 6 officers in tactical gear surged forward, their guns drawn, barrels glinting under the fluorescent lights. Darius froze, his bag slipping from his hand, thudding to the carpet. His pulse roared, a deafening drumbeat as he raised his arms, palms open, his suit jacket flapping loose. "What the hell?" Mia shouted, stepping forward, but an officer shoved her back, her journal hitting the wall. "Passengers!" screamed, scrambling away, the teenage girl fumbling her phone, filming through shaking hands. The lead cop, a burly man with a buzz cut and a badge reading Voss, grabbed Darius's arm, wrenching it behind his back. "You're under arrest for suspected terrorism," he barked, his breath hot against Darius's ear. "Planted. A device on this flight. Move!" The cuffs snapped on again, tighter this time, the metal slicing into his already raw wrists. Darius's mind reeled, the word terrorism a sledgehammer to his chest. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his core. "Check the footage. I didn't do anything." The cop smirked, his grip tightening. "Tell it to the feds." They dragged him down the jet bridge, his shoes scuffing the floor, passengers gaping from the plane's doorway. Mia yelled, "He's innocent! She set him up!" But her voice faded as the cops hauled him into the terminal. Through the glass he glimpsed Karen standing near the gate, her uniform swapped for a black coat, her blonde hair loose now, framing a face alight with smug triumph. She met his gaze, her lips curling into a vicious grin, then turned away, vanishing into the crowd. The pieces clicked, her radio call, her wrench, her lie about a threat. She'd called ahead, spun a tale of a bomb, and this cop, Voss, her brother maybe, was her hammer. Sirens wailed outside, red and blue lights flashing across the tarmac as they shoved him toward a waiting van. "You've got the wrong guy," Darius said, his tone firm, his eyes locked on the lead cop. "She sabotaged the plane, not me." The cop laughed, a harsh bark. "Sure, buddy, save it." The van door slammed shut, the darkness swallowing him, the cuffs a cold reminder of her reach. He'd thought the video cleared him, thought her firing was the end game, but this was her real play, a counterattack so brutal it turned his victory to ash. The plane's chaos was just the opening act. Now she'd branded him a terrorist, her brother's badge, her weapon. The van lurched forward, tires squealing, and Darius's mind raced. He'd beaten her twice, once with his ticket, once with the footage, but this? This was a war he hadn't seen coming, and Seattle was her battlefield. The police van screeched through Seattle's rain-slicked streets, its tires cutting sharp arcs across the wet pavement, the siren a piercing wail that drowned out the city's midnight hum. Darius Jackson sat in the back, his wrists cuffed tight. Behind him, the metal grinding against his raw skin, sending jolts of pain up his arms. His gray suit was a wreck now, the jacket torn at the shoulder from the cop's rough grip, his white shirt streaked with grime from the jet bridge scuffle. The van smelled of mildew and motor oil, the air thick and stale, pressing against his chest as he fought to steady his breathing. His glasses sat crooked on his nose, one lens smudged with a fingerprint he couldn't wipe away, blurring the dim glow of the van's interior light. Outside, the city flashed by in streaks of neon and shadow, the Space Needle a distant silhouette against the storm clouds. He replayed the arrest. Karen Voss's smug grin burned into his mind. Her black coat a stark contrast to the chaos she'd unleashed. The van lurched to a stop, brakes squealing, and the doors flew open, cold air rushing in with the sting of rain. Officer Nate Voss, his buzz cut glistening with droplets, yanked Darius out, his meaty hand clamping around his arm like a vice. "Move it," Nate growled, his voice a low rumble, his badge catching the floodlights as they hit the tarmac outside SeaTac's terminal. Darius stumbled, his shoes slipping on the wet asphalt, but he straightened, his jaw set, refusing to crumble. Then, the ambush hit. A swarm of cops surrounded him, their boots splashing through puddles, their shouts a cacophony of orders. "Down! Now!" one barked, and before he could react, Nate slammed him against the van's side, the metal cold and unforgiving against his cheek. Pain exploded in his ribs, a sharp crack stealing his breath, and cameras flashed, their strobes blinding him, through the downpour. News vans lined the perimeter, their satellite dishes looming like vultures, reporters shouting over the rain. "Suspected terrorist apprehended," a voice boomed, amplified by a megaphone, cutting through the clamor. Passengers from the flight spilled out of the terminal, Mia Torres among them, her braids plastered to her face as she pushed forward, her voice raw. "He's innocent. This is a setup." The teenage girl filmed, her phone trembling in her hands, her hoodie soaked through. But the cops shoved them back, batons raised, their line unbreakable. Nate twisted Darius's arm higher, his smirk a mirror of Karen's, his breath hot with tobacco. "You thought you'd walk away? My sister called me, said you're a threat." He leaned closer, his whisper venomous. "First-class terrorism, huh? We'll make it stick." Darius's pulse roared, his mind racing as the cuffs bit deeper, blood trickling warm down his wrist. "You got nothing," he said, his voice steady despite the pain, his eyes locked on Nate's. "She sabotaged the plane, not me." Nate laughed, a harsh, guttural sound, and slammed him again, the van rocking with the force. The cameras caught it all. Flashes popping like gunfire, the footage streaming live to screens across the city. "Breaking news," a reporter's voice cut through, crisp and urgent. "Darius Jackson, accused of planting a device on Flight 472, apprehended after a dramatic landing. Sources say he threatened the crew mid-flight." The lie spread like wildfire, the crowd swelling, some shouting slurs, others gaping in horror. Mia fought to the front, her journal gone, her fists pounding the air. "Check the video, he's the victim here." But the cops pushed her back, her cries swallowed by the storm. Darius was dragged across the tarmac, his legs buckling as Nate's crew hauled him toward a holding area, a concrete box lit by harsh fluorescence. They threw him inside, the door slamming shut, the clang echoing in his ears. He hit the floor, his knees scraping the rough surface, his glasses skittering across the tile. Hours crawled by, the rain drumming against the roof, each drop a hammer to his resolve. He sat against the wall, his suit soaked, his ribs aching with every breath. Then a new cop entered, a wiry man with a clipboard, his face neutral. "We've got no device," he said, his tone flat. "Video checks out. You're free to go." Relief surged, a fleeting spark, as they uncuffed him, the metal falling away with a clatter. He stood wincing, retrieving his glasses, the smudge still blurring. His vision. "Told you," he muttered, his voice hoarse but firm. The cop shrugged, handing him his bag. "Get out." Darius stepped into the terminal, the rain easing to a drizzle, the crowd thinning as the news vans packed up. Mia rushed over, her eyes blazing. "You're okay?" He nodded, forcing a tight smile. "Yeah, thanks for fighting." The teenage girl approached, her footage uploaded now, her voice shaky. "It's going viral. People will see the truth." He exhaled, the weight lifting slightly, the public's eye his shield. He thought he'd dodged the bullet, beaten Karen's frame up with the lack of evidence. Then, his phone buzzed, a text lighting up the cracked screen. "Fired. Reputation risk, effective immediately." His firm, the one he'd poured years into, had cut him loose. the terrorism label a stain too deep to scrub. His stomach sank, the victory hollowed out in an instant. Karen's grin flashed in his mind. Her brother's brutality her proxy, their reach extending beyond the flight. He'd cleared his name with the cops, but his career lay in ruins. The public humiliation a wound that wouldn't heal. The terminal buzzed around him, travelers oblivious to his collapse, the air thick with the scent of wet coats and coffee. Mia gripped his shoulder, her touch steady. "We'll fix this," she said, her tone fierce. He nodded, but doubt gnawed at him. Karen wasn't done. This was her opening salvo, a calculated gut punch to his life. Nate's badge, her lie, the cameras. They'd turned his stand into a spectacle, and the fallout was just beginning. He grabbed his bag, the strap biting into his palm, and stepped into the night, the city's lights a mocking glow against the dark. Hey folks, if you're raging that Darius got brutalized for just sitting in his seat, smash that like button to stand with him. Comment number 1, if you think Karen and Nate deserve to pay for this setup. Let's hear your ire, and if you're hooked on seeing this fight for justice unfold, subscribe now. We're diving deeper every step. Tell us, what's the worst betrayal you've faced from someone with power? Now buckle up. How far will Karen's revenge stretch? Will Darius's viral video turn the tide, or is she already plotting something nastier to bury him for good? Stay tuned. The Seattle night pressed against Darius Jackson's condo windows, a damp shroud of fog rolling off Puget Sound, blurring the city lights into smears of gold and red. He slumped on his leather couch, the cushions sinking under his weight, his gray suit swapped for a faded hoodie and jeans, the fabric soft but heavy with the day's wreckage. His ribs ached from Nate Voss's blows, a dull throb pulsing with each breath. His wrists still raw from cuffs, now bandaged with gauze he'd found in a drawer. The living room smelled of pine cleaner and rain-soaked air seeping through a cracked window. The silence broken only by the faint drip of a faucet in the kitchen. His phone lay dark on the coffee table, the cracked screen a mute witness to his firm's betrayal. The text, fired. Reputation risk. A fresh scar on his mind. His glasses rested beside it, the smudged lens catching the glow of a single lamp, its light pooling across the hardwood floor. He'd made it home from SeaTac, a 40-minute Uber ride through slick streets, the driver's small talk a buzz he'd tuned out. The condo, a sleek space of exposed brick and steel he'd designed himself, felt hollow now, its walls echoing, the collapse of his world. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands rubbing his face, the stubble rough against his palms. Mia's words, "We'll fix this," rang in his ears. A lifeline he clung to as he pulled his laptop closer, its screen flickering to life. The teenage girl's footage from the flight had hit the internet, uploaded an hour ago, and he clicked play, the shaky video filling the room with familiar chaos. Karen's wrench, his cuffs, Nate's brutality. Comments scrolled fast, outraged, supportive, a tidal wave of voices calling out the injustice. "This man's a hero," one read. "That cop's a thug," another spat. Views climbed past 10,000, then 20, the numbers ticking up like a heartbeat. Darius exhaled, a spark of hope igniting. He posted the link on his own socials, tagging news outlets, his fingers flying across the keys with a defiance he hadn't felt since the plane. "This is the truth," he typed. "I won't let them bury me." He hit send, the post lighting up with likes, retweets, a roar of virtual fists raised with him. His chest loosened, the tide turning, the public's eye a shield against Karen's lies. He stood, stretching his sore limbs, and shuffled to the kitchen, the tile cool under his socks. He grabbed a glass, filling it from the sink, the water sharp and metallic on his tongue. For a moment, he believed he'd flipped the script, that this viral wave would drown her revenge. Then, the night shattered. The front door exploded inward, wood splintering with a deafening crack, the lock tearing free in a spray of shards. Darius dropped the glass, it smashing on the floor, water pooling as 3 figures stormed in, their boots thudding heavy on the hardwood. Nate Voss led them, his buzz cut glinting under the lamp, his police uniform swapped for a black jacket, his eyes wild with rage. 2 others flanked him, hulking men in ski masks, their fists clenched, one gripping a baseball bat, its wood scuffed. and dark. "You think you're smart?" Nate snarled, his voice a guttural growl, his baton swinging loose in his hand. "Posting that video? Big mistake." Darius backed up, his pulse hammering, his hands raised. "Get out," he said, his tone steady despite the fear clawing his chest. "You've got no right here." Nate laughed, a vicious bark, and lunged, his baton cracking across Darius's shoulder, pain flaring white-hot. He stumbled, crashing into the counter, dishes clattering to the floor. The masked men moved fast, one swinging the bat into a shelf, books and glass tumbling in a chaotic heap, the other grabbing a can of spray paint from a bag, its nozzle hissing as red slurs slashed across the brick walls. "Thug. Terrorist. Go back!" The stench of aerosol stung Darius's nose, his vision swimming as Nate grabbed his hoodie, slamming him against the fridge, the handle digging into his spine. "Karen says hi," Nate hissed, his breath sour with beer, his fist driving into Darius's gut, air rushing out in a choked gasp. Darius doubled over, his ribs screaming, but he swung back, his knuckles grazing Nate's jaw, a fleeting hit before the Batman tackled him, pinning him to the floor. The wood pressed cold against his cheek, his glasses gone, lost in the fray. Blood trickled from his lip, warm and coppery as Nate loomed over him, his boot grinding into Darius's hand, bones creaking under the pressure. "You're done," Nate spat, his voice thick with triumph. "Nobody'll believe you now." The masked men trashed the place, overturning the couch, smashing the TV, glass crunching under their boots. Darius fought to breathe, his body a map of bruises, his mind racing. He'd won online, turned the narrative, and this was their answer, a raw personal strike to break him. Then, Nate crouched, his face inches away, and dropped a photo onto the floor, its edges curling in the damp. Darius's eyes widened, his heart seizing. It was Tanya, his sister, smiling in her nurse's scrubs, her face circled in red marker, a jagged "She's next" scrawled beside it. "Leave her alone," Darius rasped, his voice a broken shard, his hands clawing at the floor. Nate grinned, his teeth bared. Too late. He stood kicking the photo closer and signaled his crew. They retreated, boots pounding out the door, the night swallowing them as fast as they'd come. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating, the condo a war zone of shattered furniture and hateful words. Darius pushed up, wincing, his body screaming, blood dripping onto the tile. He grabbed the photo, his fingers trembling, Tanya's face a beacon in the dark. His phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with notifications. 30,000 views now, comments flooding in, the video a wildfire. He'd struck back, exposed them, and this was their counterpunch, a brutal invasion to silence him, a threat to the one person he'd die for. He staggered to the sink, splashing water on his face, the cold jolting him awake. His victory online had lit a fuse, and Karen, through Nate, had detonated it, her reach deeper, crueler than he'd imagined. He found his glasses, cracked but wearable, and slipped them on, the world sharpening into focus. The walls glared back, their slurs a taunt, Tanya's photo a ticking clock. He'd thought he'd turned it around, thought the public's roar would protect him. But this was a new battlefield, personal and vicious, and they'd drawn first blood. He grabbed his phone, his fingers slick with sweat, and dialed Tanya, the line ringing unanswered, each tone a stab to his gut. The condo loomed around him, its ruin a testament to their rage, the night outside a void promising worse to come. The Seattle dawn crept through the shattered blinds of Darius Jackson's condo, a pale gray light spilling across the wreckage, painting the red slurs on the walls in sickly hues. He stood hunched over the kitchen counter, his hoodie stained. With dried blood, his jeans ripped at the knee from the night's brawl. His ribs pulsed with a deep gnawing ache, his busted lips swollen and tender, the taste of copper lingering on his tongue. His cracked glasses perched unevenly on his nose, one lens spiderwebbed but still functional, framing a world tilted sharp with urgency. The air smelled of spray paint and broken glass, the faucet's drip a relentless metronome against the silence. Tanya's photo lay beside his phone, her circled face a silent scream, the "She's next" scrawl a blade to his heart. He'd called her 10 times, each unanswered ring tightening the knot in his chest, her voicemail a cold wall he couldn't breach. His laptop glowed on the counter. The viral video now at 50,000 views, comments piling up like bricks. In a fortress, justice for Darius. Cops are corrupt. But the triumph felt hollow, drowned by the ruin around him. He grabbed his keys, the jagged edges biting his palm, and stumbled out, the condo's splintered door banging shut behind him. The stairwell echoed with his uneven steps, his sneakers scuffing the concrete, his breath ragged as he hit the street. Rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and gleaming under a sky bruised with clouds. His beat-up sedan waited in the lot, its blue paint chipped, a relic of better days. He slid in, the leather seat cold against his back, and gunned the engine, tires squealing as he peeled toward Tanya's house in Rainier Valley, 15 miles south. The city blurred past, wet streets and neon signs a smear through his cracked windshield, his mind racing faster than the car. Nate's crew had trashed his life, threatened his sister, and Karen's shadow loomed behind it all, her firing a spark to this inferno. He gripped the wheel, knuckles white, the photo burned into his vision. Tanya, his little sister, the nurse, who'd patched him up after schoolyard fights, who'd cried when he landed his first big contract. She didn't deserve this. The drive stretched endless, traffic lights mocking him with red, until he screeched into her quiet street, bungalows lining the block, her yellow house a beacon at the end. He parked crooked, bolting out, his ribs screaming as he sprinted to her porch. The door hung ajar, wood splintered at the lock and his stomach dropped, a cold sweat breaking across his skin. "Tanya!" he shouted, his voice raw, cracking the morning stillness. He shoved inside, the living room pristine but eerie. Her coffee mug still warm on the table, steam curling faintly. Her scrubs lay folded on the couch, her keys gone. Relief flickered. She was alive here minutes ago, but dread clawed deeper. He checked the kitchen, the bedrooms, each empty. Her lavender scent lingering like a ghost. Then, a creak from the back door froze him, his pulse hammering as he crept toward it. The yard stretched dark, a shadow moving fast near the fence. He lunged out, spotting a figure in a hoodie slipping away, too quick to chase with his battered body. Back inside, he found her phone on the counter, a text glowing. "Saw unmarked car tailing me at hospital, heading to work early. Sent an hour ago." His gut twisted. She'd been followed, Nate's doing, no doubt. He floored it to Harborview Medical Center, her workplace, the city waking slow around him, headlights cutting through fog. The hospital loomed, a gray fortress of glass and steel, its ER entrance buzzing with ambulances. He parked, sloppy, hobbling in, his hoodie a stark contrast to the sterile white halls. Nurses bustled, their shoes squeaking on linoleum, the air sharp with antiseptic. He found Tanya at the triage desk, her scrubs crisp, her braids pulled back, her face tight with strain. "Darius?" she gasped, rushing over, her hands hovering over his bruises. "What happened?" He pulled her aside, his voice low, urgent. "Nate Voss and his crew hit my place, left this." He thrust the photo at her, her eyes widening as she traced the red circle. "They're after you now." "You saw a car?" She nodded, her fingers trembling. "Black sedan, no plates. Followed me from the lot. Then 2 cops came in an hour ago asking about you, saying you confessed to the plane thing. I told them it's bullshit." Anger flared in her voice, her fists clenching. Darius's mind raced. Nate's harassment, pinning his confession on Tanya, another layer of Karen's revenge. He grabbed her laptop from her bag, hacking the hospital's security feed with skills from his tech days, his fingers flying over keys, grainy footage loaded. The sedan circling the lot, 2 uniformed cops, Nate's lackeys, grilling Tanya at the desk, her defiance clear. He saved it, emailing it to himself, proof to clear his name again. "Got him," he said, a grim smile, breaking through. "They're lying, and this shows it." Tanya squeezed his arm, her resolve steeling. "We'll fight this." He felt the tide shift, their bond a weapon, the footage his ammo. Then, his phone buzzed, a news alert. "Darius," Jackson threatens family, audio evidence surfaces. His blood ran cold as he clicked, a distorted clip of his voice. I'll make Tanya pay. Doctored from some old call. Now live on every outlet. Karen's handiwork, leaked to twist the public against him. Tanya's face paled, her breath hitching. That's not you. He nodded, fury boiling. She's framing me as a monster. The hospital hummed around them, patients shuffling past, oblivious to the storm. He'd saved Tanya, turned the tables with the footage, thought he'd struck back. Until this. Karen's counterattack was ruthless, personal, painting him a traitor to his own blood. Nurses whispered, glancing his way, the audio spreading, like poison. He pulled Tanya close, his voice a growl. They won't win. But doubt gnawed, his condo trashed, his job gone. Now this lie tearing at his family. Nate's tale, the cops' lies, the fake audio. It was a noose tightening. Karen's vengeance a tidal wave he couldn't outrun. He clutched the laptop. The footage his lifeline, but the world was turning and he was sinking fast. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glare across the triage desk where Darius Jackson stood beside his sister Tanya. Her scrubs wrinkled from a long shift, her braids tight against her scalp. His hoodie clung to his bruised frame, the fabric stiff with dried blood, his jeans torn at the knee, his cracked glasses slipping down his nose. His ribs throbbed with each shallow breath, his lip pulsing where Nate's fist had landed, but his eyes burned with a fierce resolve. The air smelled of bleach and tension. The hum of the ER a distant drone as nurses shuffled past, their glances sharp with suspicion. Tanya's laptop sat open between them, the hacked security footage paused on Nate's lackeys harassing her, a lifeline in their fight. Her phone glowed with the fake audio. I'll make Tanya pay. It's distorted, echo looping on news sites. Karen Voss's latest dagger now viral at 80,000 plays. Darius's hands clenched, his knuckles raw, as he watched the hospital TV flicker to a live broadcast, his face plastered across the screen. Darius Jackson, flight terrorist, now threatens family. The anchor's voice boomed, cold and clinical, the doctored clip replaying behind her. Tanya's grip tightened on his arm, her voice a hiss. They're eating it up. He nodded, fury simmering, but he had a plan. He pulled his own phone, the cracked screen flaring as he uploaded the hospital footage to his socials, tagging every outlet with a caption. This is the truth. Cops lie. Audio's fake. He hit post, the video rocketing past 100,000 views in minutes, comments exploding. He's innocent. Karen's a monster, a counterwave crashing against her lies. Tanya exhaled, a flicker of hope in her eyes. You're turning it, she said, her tone steadying. He drove, back to his condo, the city a blur of wet streets and dawn fog, dropping Tanya at a friend's to hide from Nate's reach. The ruined living room greeted him, slurs glaring red on the walls, glass crunching under his sneakers. He grabbed his laptop, tracking the footage's spread. 200,000 views now, trending nationwide. Protests sparked outside Karen's last known address, a rented duplex in Tacoma. Her name a curse on picket signs. Fire her for real. Justice now. News vans swarmed, their lights piercing the morning haze, and Darius felt the tide shift, a real victory swelling in his chest. He sank onto the wrecked couch, its springs groaning, and cracked a water bottle, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. Karen was in hiding, her scheme backfiring, the public's roar his armor. He'd beaten her again, flipped the narrative. With raw proof, thought he'd finally cornered her. Then the storm broke. His phone buzzed, alerts piling up, 300,000 views, but the comments shifted, venomous now. He's lying. Family traitor. Tabloids ran the audio on loop, airline insiders leaking proof he'd staged the flight chaos, their headlines screaming, "Black man terrorizes flight family." The hospital footage drowned under a flood of bots and trolls, his truth buried in noise. Outside, tires screeched, a crowd gathering, their shouts filtering through the cracked window. "Terrorist! Get him!" Darius stood, his pulse spiking, peering out as a mob swelled. 20, then 50, faces twisted with rage, some clutching bricks, others pipes. They'd bought Karen's lie, her allies in the airline fanning the flames, turning his stand into a target. The first brick smashed through the window, glass shattering inward, shards slicing his arm as he ducked. Pain flared, blood welling, hot, and the mob roared, a second brick thudding against the wall, plaster crumbling. He grabbed his laptop, bolting for the back door as boots pounded the porch, the front entrance buckling under a battering ram. "You can't hide!" a voice bellowed thick with hate, as pipes clanged against the frame, wood splintering. Darius burst into the alley, rain stinging his cuts, his sneakers slipping on wet concrete. The mob spilled around the building, cutting off the street, their shadows looming in the fog. A pipe swung, grazing his shoulder, pain exploding as he stumbled, his laptop slipping, screen cracking on the pavement. He scrambled up, heart hammering, and sprinted, their shouts a thunder at his heels. "Lynch him! He's done!" A racist tide unleashed by Karen's audio, her revenge twisting strangers into executioners. He darted through a side street, fog cloaking him, his breath ragged, ribs screaming. A car screeched past, nearly clipping him, its horn blaring as he dove behind a dumpster, the stench of rot choking him. The mob's roar faded, their footsteps scattering, and he crouched, blood dripping onto the asphalt, his hoodie torn wider now. He'd survived. Barely. His condo trashed again. His life a hunted thing. He'd thought the protest nailed her, thought the footage was his shield. Until this. Then, his phone buzzed, a text from Tanya. "Cops took me, saying I helped you, on the plane." His blood froze, the screen shaking in his hand. Nate's crew had struck, arresting her with lies, Karen's next blow landing harder, crueler. He'd exposed her, turned the public, only for her to weaponize it. Her allies burying him in a media lynch mob and snatching Tanya as collateral. The alley stretched dark, rain pooling around him, his body a map of wounds. He clutched the phone, the cracked laptop at his feet, his victory ash in his mouth. Karen wasn't hiding. She was hunting, and this was her checkmate, a public and personal gutting he couldn't outrun. "Hey, folks, if you're boiling that a mob turned on Darius over a fake audio, slam that like button to back his fight." Comment. Number 1. If you think Karen's gone too far, twisting the world against him, let's see your fury. And if you're gripped by this battle against a system stacked to crush him, subscribe now. We're not stopping here. Tell us, what's the wildest lie you've seen turn a crowd? Now brace yourselves. With Tanya nabbed, how deep does Karen's net reach? Will Darius claw back from this brink, or has she rigged a trap he can't escape? Next part's coming hot. The Seattle rain hammered the alley where Darius Jackson crouched behind a dumpster, its rusted edge biting into his palm, the stench of garbage thick in his lungs. His hoodie hung in tatters, soaked with blood and water, his jeans caked with mud from the mob's chase, his cracked glasses fogging with each ragged breath. His ribs screamed, a sharp stab with every move, his arm oozing red from a glass shard's kiss, the cracked laptop at his feet a shattered lifeline. The city loomed dark around him, fog curling through the streets. The mob's shouts fading into an eerie hum as they scattered, their pipes and bricks left behind. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Tanya's text. "Cops took me, saying I helped, you on the plane." A weight sinking deeper into his gut. He stood, wincing, his sneakers squelching as he scooped up the laptop, its screen flickering but alive. The hospital footage, his proof, was still there, a fragile thread against Karen Voss's web. He limped to his sedan, parked blocks away, the engine coughing to life as he peeled toward downtown, the courthouse his only shot. The streets blurred past, headlights slicing through mist, his mind a storm of fury and focus. Tanya, locked up, on lies was Karen's cruelest strike yet, and he'd be damned if he let it stand. He'd sued the airline days ago, a desperate jab after Nate's invasion, and now it was his weapon. The courthouse loomed, a gray slab of stone against the dawn, its steps slick as he staggered up, clutching the laptop like a shield. Inside, the halls echoed with his uneven steps, marble cold underfoot, the air thick with polish and power. He filed an emergency motion, his voice hoarse but firm to the clerk, a young woman with wide eyes who nodded fast. "For my sister. She's innocent." Hours later, he sat in a courtroom, his suit swapped for a borrowed blazer from a legal aid lawyer. Its fit loose over his battered frame. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair, banged her gavel, the sound a gunshot in the quiet. "Darius, Jackson versus Sky High Airlines," she intoned, her gaze piercing. His lawyer, a wiry man named Eli, laid out the case. Karen's sabotage, Nate's brutality, the airline's cover-up. Darius played the hospital footage, the screen flickering as Nate's lackeys grilled Tanya, their lies exposed. The airline's attorney, a slick suit with a shark's grin, squirmed, his defense thin. "Unsubstantiated," he blustered. But the judge's frown deepened. "I'm issuing a warrant for Karen Voss," she declared, her voice steel. "Her actions endangered lives. Case pending." Cheers erupted from a handful of supporters, Mia Torres among them, her braids swinging as she clapped, her eyes fierce. Darius exhaled, a flood of relief washing over him, his biggest win yet. Karen was cornered, the law finally baring its teeth. He rushed to the precinct, the footage his key, demanding Tanya's release. She emerged hours later, her scrubs rumpled, her face drawn but unbroken, throwing her arms around him. "You did it," she whispered, her voice cracking. He grinned, pain forgotten, the courthouse victory a beacon in the dark. They drove to a diner, neon buzzing outside, the smell of coffee and grease a balm as they slid into a booth. Tanya sipped water, her hand steady now, and he felt the tide turn, his sister free, Karen on the ropes. He'd flipped the script, thought he'd won, until Nate struck back. The next day, Tanya's trial hit, a sham rigged by Nate's judge, Buddy, a paunchy man with a crooked tie named Hargrove. Darius stormed the courthouse again, Mia's flight footage in hand, the wrench scene his ace. The courtroom buzzed, reporters packing the benches, their pens scratching fast. Hargrove sneered as the prosecution spun a tale. Tanya aided Darius's terrorism, fake evidence piling up, forged texts, doctored logs. "She's complicit," the DA barked, his glasses glinting. Tanya sat, her head high, her scrubs swapped for a plain dress, her silence a defiance. Darius leapt up, slamming the footage onto the projector, his voice a roar. "This proves it's lies. Karen sabotaged the plane. Nate's framing us." The wrench gleamed on screen, gasps rippling through the room, Hargrove's gavel slamming uselessly. "Order!" he shouted. But the tide turned, jurors shifting, reporters typing furiously. Eli pounced, tearing into the DA's fakes, the footage a sledgehammer to their case. Hargrove's face reddened, his bias cracking, and he relented, his voice grudging. "Charges dismissed. Defendant released." Tanya stood, free again, the room erupting. Darius's heart soaring as they hugged, her tears soaking his shoulder. He'd flipped it mid-hearing, his evidence a knockout. Karen's, puppet judge powerless. They stepped outside, rain pelting the steps, Mia grinning beside them, the city alive with their win. He thought he'd buried her this time. Nate's sham shattered, justice clawing back. Then, his phone buzzed, an email from Karen's lawyer, a name he didn't know, Preston Lyle. Defamation suit filed against Darius Jackson, $10 million. Sky High stands with Ms. Voss. His breath caught, the screen glowing cold in his hand. A countersue, backed by a racist billionaire, some tycoon tied to the airline, their legal muscle a wall of suits and cash. Tanya's eyes widened, her voice a whisper. They won't stop. He nodded, dread sinking in, the victory souring fast. The courthouse win, Tanya's freedom. It was a peak, his boldest strike yet. But Karen's retaliation loomed larger, a tidal wave of debt and threats. Preston's name linked to a mogul, Richard Hale, a man known for crushing dissent with money and malice, his fortune built on shady deals. The diner's warmth faded in memory, the rain outside a mirror to his sinking hope. He'd turned the trial, saved Tanya, only for Karen to bury him in a legal abyss, her billionaire ally a hammer to his defiance. The courthouse steps stretched empty now, the city's hum a taunt, his body a map of scars, his bank account a ghost soon to be gutted. He clutched the phone, the footage his shield. But this fight was shifting. Karen's war a machine he couldn't outpace. The Seattle dusk settled heavy over the city, a thick shroud of clouds choking the skyline. The rain reduced to a fine mist that clung to Darius Jackson's battered hoodie as he stood outside the diner, his breath fogging in the chill. His jeans, stuck to his legs, damp and stiff. His cracked glasses fogged at the edges, framing a world blurred with exhaustion and resolve. His ribs ached, a persistent fire beneath his skin. His arm bandaged where glass had sliced him, the pain a dull roar he'd learned to ignore. Tanya stood beside him, her scrubs swapped for a jacket, her braids tucked under a cap, her face etched with relief from her courtroom win, but shadowed by the countersue's weight. The diner's neon buzzed behind them, its warmth a fading memory. As they faced the courthouse steps, the email from Preston Lyle, defamation suit $10 million, a cold blade in Darius's gut. His phone glowed in his hand, the cracked screen a testament to his fight, the hospital footage and Mia's flight video his only armor. The city hummed around them, headlights slicing through the mist, horns a distant wail as he turned to Tanya. "I'm not letting them bury us," he said, his voice low, steel threading through it. She nodded, her grip tightening on his arm. "We've got proof. Use it." He drove to a friend's basement office, a cluttered space of flickering bulbs and humming servers, the air thick with dust and coffee. Jamal, a wiry tech whiz with dreads and a quick grin, cracked his knuckles over a keyboard, his setup a tangle of wires and screens. "Let's dig," he said, diving into the airline's digital underbelly at Darius's nod. Hours bled into night, the basement a cocoon of clicking keys and glowing code, until Jamal froze, his eyes wide. "Got it. Internal memos, sky-high to Karen." Darius leaned in, the screen blazing with truth. Emails proving the airline shielded her sabotage, paid Nate's crew to silence him, buried complaints to dodge lawsuits. "Protect Voss at all costs," one read, signed by the CEO, a slick exec named Gerald Tate. "Jackson's a liability. Neutralize him." Another outlined cash to Richard Hale, the billionaire, to fund her legal war. Darius's pulse roared, his hands trembling as he saved the files, a gold mine to turn the tide. He leaked them online, the basement's dim light a stark contrast to the firestorm he unleashed. 500,000 views in hours, headlines screaming, "Sky High covers up racism, violence." Protests swelled outside the airline's headquarters, a glass tower downtown chants echoing through the mist. "Shut it down! Justice for Darius!" Picketers clashing with security, their signs a forest of fury. The CEO resigned that night, a press release flashing across screens, his exit a white flag under public rage. Darius watched from the basement, the TV, flickering with news vans swarming Tate's mansion, his face hailed as a hero online. He exposed them. Legend. The memo's a sledgehammer to Karen's empire. Tanya grinned, her voice bright. "You did it, D." Jamal clapped his shoulder, his dreads bouncing. "They're toast." Darius exhaled, the weight lifting, his evidence a knockout blow, the airline cracking under his stand. He'd cornered them, thought he'd won, until the billionaire struck back. Morning broke, gray and cold. The basement, TV blaring a new wave, Hale's smear campaign, a blitz of cash and lies. Bribed witnesses surfaced on every channel. Passengers claiming Darius staged the flight chaos, a mechanic swearing he'd planted the wrench, their eyes shifty, but their stories slick. "He paid me to lie," one choked out, then recanted under Hale's glare, the retraction buried in noise. Social media flooded with bots. "Jackson's a fraud." "Liar," drowning the memos, his hero status flipping to villain overnight. Allies vanished, Mia texting a hurried, "I'm out, too hot." Her support snuffed by fear. Darius's stomach sank, the basement walls closing in, Jamal's screens a graveyard of his fight. Then, a boom shook the street, a fireball erupting blocks away. Tanya's car torched in her friend's drive, flames licking the sky. Sirens wailed, news choppers buzzing overhead, the anchor's voice grim. Retaliation suspected in Jackson case. Darius bolted out, Jamal trailing, the mist thick with smoke as they reached the scene, the car a blackened husk, Tanya safe but shaken inside. "Nate's crew," she whispered, her cap gone, her eyes wide. Saw them peel off. Darius's fists clenched, blood seeping through his bandage, the memos his sword now dulled by Hale's war chest. Karen's puppet master had escalated, firebombing his sister's life as a warning, crushing his momentum with a tidal wave of lies and violence. The crowd gawked, firefighters dousing the wreck, the air acrid with burning rubber. His phone buzzed, alerts piling up, views dropping, comments turning. He's guilty. Set it up himself. Hale's bribes rewriting reality. Tanya gripped his hand, her voice a thread. What now? He stared at the flames, his body a map of scars, his allies gone, the basement's triumph ash in his mouth. He'd uncovered the conspiracy, toppled the CEO, only for Hale to bury him in a storm of corruption and fire, isolating him on a battlefield he couldn't map. The mist swirled, the city a beast turning against him. Karen's reach a shadow he couldn't shake. The Seattle night cloaked the city in a damp veil, the mist curling thick around the charred skeleton of Tanya's car, its twisted metal glinting under flickering streetlights. Darius Jackson stood in the driveway, his hoodie soaked with drizzle, the fabric heavy against his bruised shoulders, his jeans stiff with mud and blood. His cracked glasses hung low, one lens shattered now, his vision halved but sharp with fury. His ribs burned, each breath a jagged stab, his arms bandage unraveling, red seeping through from the mob's glass shard. Tanya gripped his elbow, her jacket zipped tight, her braids damp under a borrowed scarf, her eyes wide but steady after the firebombing. The air reeked of gasoline and ash, sirens fading as firefighters packed up, their hoses dripping onto the cracked pavement. Jamal lingered behind, his dreads tucked under a hood, his laptop clutched tight, its cracked screen a mirror to their fight. Darius's phone buzzed in his pocket, the memo's views tanking under Hale's smear, the world turning against him, but he silenced it, his jaw set. "She's not winning," he said, his voice a low growl, his gaze locked on the horizon, where the Cascades loomed dark. Tanya nodded, her breath fogging. "We end this." He'd lost everything, job, home, allies, but the memos were his ace, and Karen's confession would bury her. Jamal hacked her phone logs from the basement, tracing her to a cabin near Snoqualmie Pass, 40 miles east, a hideout Hale's cash had bought. Darius drove, the sedan's engine rattling, Tanya beside him, Jamal in back, the road winding through pine and fog, headlights cutting a narrow path. The cabin emerged, a squat shadow against the cliffs, its windows dark, a pickup parked out front, its plates smeared with mud. Darius parked a quarter-mile off, the trio creeping through wet underbrush, twigs snapping underfoot, the air cold and pine-sharp. He rigged a trap with Jamal's help, mics and a camera from a gas station, hall, wired to stream live. His plan a desperate gambit. They slipped inside, the door creaking open to a stale whiff of wood smoke and whiskey, the room sparse with a sagging couch and a table strewn with maps. Karen Voss sat there, her blonde hair loose, her black coat swapped for a sweater, her eyes glinting as she spun a knife on the table, its blade catching the lantern's glow. "Knew you'd come," she said, her voice smooth, venomous, her smirk a taunt. Darius stepped forward, his mic hidden, his tone steel. "It's over. I've got the memos. You're done." She laughed, a sharp bark, standing slow, the knife in hand. "Hale's got deeper pockets than your little videos. You're a ghost now." He pressed, his words bait. "Why'd you sabotage the plane? Why me?" Her smirk widened, her ego cracking the door. "You didn't belong up there. I fixed it. Wrench on the hydraulics easy. Airline covered it. Hale paid me. You're just collateral." The mic hummed, her confession streaming live, views ticking up, 10,000, 20, his trap snapping shut. She lunged, the knife, slashing air, but he dodged, his ribs screaming, tackling her to the floor, the blade skittering away. Tanya grabbed it, her hands steady, as Jamal filmed, the feed a lifeline to the world. Karen thrashed, her nails raking his arm, but he pinned her his knee on her chest, her breath heaving. "You lose," he said, his voice raw, triumph surging. Sirens wailed in the distance, the stream hitting 50,000, comments flooding. She admitted it. "Arrest her!" The cabin a stage for her fall. He stood, panting. Tanya. Beside him, the knife safe in her grip, Jamal's camera steady. Karen glared, defeated, her empire crumbling online, police lights flashing through the trees. He'd won, her confession ironclad, thought it was over, until tires crunched outside. Louder, closer, a black SUV roaring up, Nate Voss leaping out, his face a mask of rage, his gun drawn. "You bastard!" he roared, charging in, his crew piling out behind, 3 shadows with bats and chains. Darius shoved Tanya back, his body a shield, as Nate grabbed him, wrenching him outside, the mist swallowing them. The cliff loomed, sheer drop to the river below, its roar a dull thunder. Nate slammed him against the edge, gravel crunching, the gun pressed to his temple, cold and unyielding. "She's my sister," Nate snarled, his finger twitching on the trigger, his crew circling, bats raised. Darius fought, his fists wild, catching Nate's jaw, blood spraying, but the bigger man roared, hurling him to the ground, boots pounding his ribs, a crack splitting the air. Pain blinded him, his glasses gone, the cliff's edge inches away. Tanya screamed, rushing out, the knife flashing, but Nate's crew grabbed her, chains rattling as they pinned her. Jamal filmed, the stream spiking. 80,000 now, the key. World watching. Helpless. Darius rolled, his hand finding a rock, smashing it into Nate's knee, a howl tearing free as the cop stumbled. He surged up, tackling Nate, their bodies a tangle of fury, the gun skittering loose. They grappled, teetering on the brink, the river's mist rising cold below. Darius drove his elbow into Nate's throat, a choked gasp escaping, and shoved, Nate's bulk tipping over the edge, his scream swallowed by the crash of water far below. Silence fell, broken by Tanya's sob as the crew froze, bats dropping, their fight draining fast. Darius staggered up, blood streaming from his nose, his body a wreck, the mist swirling around him. He'd beaten Nate, saved Tanya. Thought the nightmare ended, until rotors thumped overhead, a helicopter slicing through the fog, its spotlight blinding, Hale's men descending, rifles cocked, Karen's voice crackling from a radio. "I'm bailed. You're dead." The stream hit 100,000, the world gasping, but Hale's guns trained on him, her empire striking back, his triumph snatched in a heartbeat. Tanya clutched his arm, Jamal's camera trembling, the cliff a trap with no escape. The cliffside loomed stark under the Seattle night, the river's roar a relentless pulse below, its icy spray mingling with the mist that wrapped Darius Jackson's battered form. His hoodie hung in shreds, soaked with blood and rain, his jeans torn to threads, his cracked glasses lost in the fight, leaving his vision a blur of shadows and light. His ribs cracked with each gasp, his arm oozing red through the tattered bandage, his face a map of bruises and cuts, blood crusting his nose. Tanya clung to his side, her jacket ripped, her scarf gone, her braids wild in the wind, her breath sharp with fear. Jamal stood frozen, his dreads plastered to his skull, his laptop streaming live from the cabin, its feed now a lifeline at 100,000 views, the world watching through his shaking hands. The helicopter's rotors thumped overhead. Hale's black beast hovering, its spotlight a searing white that pinned them to the edge, the cliff crumbling under their feet. 5 men dropped from the craft, boots thudding on gravel, rifles glinting, their faces masked, but their intent clear. Karen, Voss's voice crackled from a radio on the lead gunman's belt, sharp and triumphant. "I'm bailed. You're dead." Her words sliced through the roar, a venomous promise, her empire unbroken despite the confession, Hale's cash a shield. Darius's pulse hammered, his body screaming, but his eyes locked on the rifles, their barrels steady, death a breath, away. Tanya gripped his hand, her voice a whisper. "We're trapped." He nodded, his mind racing, the stream his only play. The gunman fanned out, cutting off the cabin, the cliff the only path left. A sheer drop to the churning water below. The lead man stepped forward, his rifle raised, his voice muffled behind the mask. "End of the line, Jackson." Darius straightened, his legs trembling, defiance burning through the pain. "You're on camera. World's watching." The man paused, his head tilting, but Karen's radio barked again. "Finish it!" The rifles cocked, a metallic chorus, and time slowed, the mist a shroud around them. Then a crack split the night, not a gunshot, but Jamal's voice, raw and loud. "It's live. They're streaming." His laptop glowed, the feed spiking, 200,300. The confession looping, Karen's words damning her anew, Hale's men caught in the glare. The gunmen faltered, their rifles dipping, the spotlight wavering as the world roared online. "Murderers! Stop them!" A digital tidal wave crashing over their plan. Darius seized the moment, his body a coil of desperation, and lunged at the lead man, his shoulder slamming into the rifle, pain exploding as they hit the ground. The gun skittered away, gravel biting his skin, and he rolled, his fist smashing the mask, blood spurting from a broken nose. Tanya kicked another, her boot cracking a shin, her scream a war cry as she fought free. Jamal ducked, filming still, the stream a chaos of fists and fog, views rocketing past 500,000. The gunmen rallied, one swinging a rifle butt, clipping Darius's temple, stars bursting in his skull, but he staggered up, the cliff's edge his only out. He grabbed Tanya, shoving her toward Jamal, his voice a rasp. "Run!" They bolted, the cabin a faint hope, but the gunmen closed, bullets pinging off rock, the spotlight blinding. Darius turned, his eyes meeting the lead man's. The rivers roar deafening below. He'd won online, exposed Karen, thought he'd turned it, until this. No way back, no way forward, the rifles a wall of death. He took a breath, his body a wreck, and leapt, the cliff dropping away, the world tilting as he plunged into the mist, the icy water rushing up fast. The impact stole his air, the current yanking him under, rocks battering his limbs. Darkness, swallowing him whole. Tanya's scream faded, the helicopter's thump a distant pulse, the stream cutting to black, 600,000 viewers gasping as he vanished. Weeks later, the fallout burned bright. Karen's empire crumbled, the confession, and Hale's ambush lived for millions, her bail revoked, jail doors slamming shut on fraud and conspiracy charges. Sky High tanked, bankruptcy filings piling up, the memos and footage a noose around its neck. Hale's men scattered, 2 caught, their masks off on the news, his fortune bleeding under lawsuits, the billionaire a pariah. Tanya mourned. Her brother, presumed dead, the river searched but empty, her tears a quiet storm in a rebuilt life. Jamal's stream hit 10 million views posthumously, Darius a legend, his stand a spark that torched a corrupt machine. The cabin stood silent, the cliff a grave, the city moving on, justice bitter, but one. Then, a shadow stirred. In a Portland dive bar, 300 miles south, a man slipped into a booth, his face scarred, his eyes hidden behind new glasses, a hoodie masking his frame. Darius Jackson sipped a beer, his ribs still tender, his arm healed but stiff. The river's pull a miracle he'd survived, crawling ashore miles downstream, a ghost reborn. He'd surfaced after weeks, the current his cloak, Hale's files, snatched from a drop point Jamal had traced, evidence to sink the billionaire for good. His phone buzzed, an encrypted email sent to the feds, bank records, voice logs, Hale's empire gutted in one stroke. He smiled, faint but fierce, free at last, the fight won on his terms. Tanya rebuilt, safe now, the world believing him gone, his legend a shield. He'd leapt, flipped the script, turned death to victory, thought it was over, until a call crackled through a burner phone, a voice he knew too well, icy and alive. "You didn't think I'd stay locked up, did you?" Karen's whisper chilled his blood, her escape a shadow creeping back, the war not done. He set the beer down, his hand steady, the bars hum a backdrop to his resolve, the fight stretching on, a legend unbroken. Darius Jackson's harrowing journey in this story reveals raw truths about resilience, systemic bias, and the power of truth in the face of unrelenting adversity. The first lesson is unwavering courage. Darius faced overt racism from Karen Voss, brutal retaliation from her brother Nate, and a corporate conspiracy fueled by billionaire Richard Hale. Yet he never backed down. His calm defiance, proving his seat, exposing sabotage, and fighting for his sister Tanya, shows that standing firm against injustice, even when the odds stack high, can spark change. Second, the story underscores the amplifying force of community and technology. Without Mia's footage, Jamal's hacking, and the viral stream hitting millions, Darius's voice might have been silenced. Collective support turned his solitary battle into a public reckoning. Third, it exposes the depth of systemic rot. Karen's firing was a facade, her power rooted in a network of privilege that twisted laws, media, and mobs against an innocent man. This teaches us that surface wins mean little without dismantling the structures beneath. Finally, Darius's leap into the river, his survival, and Karen's escape remind us that justice is a marathon, not a sprint. Victories can flip to new threats in an instant, demanding relentless vigilance. His story isn't just a tale of survival, it's a call to question who holds power and why. For every Darius, countless others face similar fights without cameras or allies. His triumph is a rare flame in a dark reality. So, what's the takeaway? Fight with proof, lean on others, and never assume the war's won. Now we turn to you. What's the toughest stand you've taken against unfairness? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if Darius's grit fired you up, and subscribe for more tales of defiance. Share this to amplify the unheard. Thanks for riding this wild journey with us. Here's to courage lighting the way forward.